Next on Two Counselors and a Mic.
I was walking out the door and I saw an ex-student walking down the sidewalk coming right to our school. And he was a freshman. And I knew him from, I had him from kindergarten through sixth grade. And I knew him and he was a little bit of a pistol, through that time. But I loved him. I loved his personality, and we had a lot of conversations through the years. And as he was coming down, I could tell he actually looked a little disheveled. And it was the first week of school. And I was asking him what he had done. And his first name was Gio. And I said, "Hey, Gio, how are you doing?" And he wasn't 100% happy, I could tell. And his hair had gotten really long. And he had said, "Oh, I'm doing okay." And I said, "Well, what are you up to?" And he goes, I just enrolled myself at Chula Vista High School. He said he enrolled himself. And I know he had lived with his grandma off and on through when he was in elementary school. And I said, "Yourself?" He goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, what's going on at home?" "Oh, it's not good." And I said, "Well, are you meeting up with friends or something like that?" He goes, "You know what, Mr. Daly, I didn't have many friends." And I go, well, you socialize people. He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Mr. Daly," goes, "you were my best friend when I was here."
Thanks for landing on our podcast, where we use the power of our collective stories to make change in the world by expanding our understanding of who we are and how we learn.
We're a podcast dedicated to exploring the ever-changing topics related to education.
My name is Lisa Johnson Davis, and I am a counselor focusing on how we learn.
And my name is Gabriela Baeza Delgado. I am a counselor interested in maximizing our collective ideas to support all students. Welcome back to Two Counselors and a Mic. I'm Gabby.
And I'm Lisa. Thanks for landing on our fourth podcast. In this podcast, we will feature some great insights from a recently retired teacher administrator, former teacher administrator for Gabby Delgado, Mr. Bob Daly. Can you just talk a little bit about Mr. Daly? I'm really interested in this interview, Gabby.
Yeah, so it is going to be slightly different because the mentee, I should say, is going to have a different role today. So I still call him Mr. Daly, but seems weird. But Bob Daly was my 5th and 6th grade teacher at Imperial Beach Elementary down in the South Bay Union School District. And so he will be our guest today, as you've mentioned. And so I kind of feel like I've known Mr. Daly my whole life because he has seen me grow up, and I've actually always kept in touch with him. So it'll be neat to be in a different role with him today.
Is he what you would consider your mentor growing up?
I would. Mr. Daly, now when I think back, a lot of how I have interacted with students, I think really stems from his teachings, and knowing that he always provided, structure and support, but he would never hesitate to tell you when you were crossing the line. And he would call me out when I would roll my eyes, and he would say, "Ms. Baeza, did I just see an eye roll?" And I would, have to write sentences or whatever the consequence was back in the day. But he definitely, I would consider him a mentor and has been an important person in my life, and has been a professional mentor to me too. Once I, graduated from college, I'd call him up to just say, "Here's something I'm running into at work," or "What do I do with this situation?" So definitely has been a mentor to me for sure.
That is an amazing piece, I think, as we think about reimagining our learning environments, that, where does mentorship come into play? And we've often talked with our colleagues about the fact that we don't have time in school. We're so regimented. There's really not a lot of time for mentorship. So there's naturally occurring mentorship that happens. But it's interesting as we start to think about how learning is expanding and thinking about these ideas. I think about my own experience at the school that I was at for many years, and the work that I did with internship. We had an internship program, and in that particular program, we were able to send out students for 4 weeks full time. We actually released them from school, and then we had some support systems and things in place. But that really became the foundation for my own research. And what I found was that it was really interesting when students, they had all these tools that we'd given them, how to communicate professionally, how to research, all these really awesome projects that they did kind of led them up to this moment in their lives. But what happened is once they went on these sites all across San Diego, you would think that, a lot of them would not succeed. But in the research, they showed that they could adapt within about a week. And so part of my thought around that was, why are they doing that? And it was that those mentors in those places of work, those people, were their anchors. And it makes you start to think about, particularly in adolescence at the high school level, like we don't have in our own society these places or spaces for really moving a young person, a child, into adolescence. We might have like a bar mitzvah or a quinceañera or other types of things that will, be these points of transition. But do schools do that effectively? And is that something that we should be thinking about in the future, particularly when we talk about equity? How do we provide these opportunities for young people to have really robust mentorships and, knowing teachers out there, that are doing all of the distance learning and all of the administrators that are trying to work with students, just knowing that having you be there and connecting with them is that anchor. Mm-hmm. And is that a place to discuss, when we talk about reimagining learning?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this idea, this unintentional mentoring. I've heard it called also as invisible mentoring, where you know that someone needs a connection, but you're not necessarily in a formal mentoring partnership where you've committed to a year, spending, 1 to 2 hours a week with a person. That's a traditional model, like a big brothers, big sisters, formal mentoring model, right? What we tend to do a lot of in expanded learning and just in education in general, is this more of invisible mentoring, right? Like you're saying, students are naturally going to gravitate to those anchors for whatever reason to an adult. And sometimes you think, I can't get this kid out of my office, or this kid wants to just always hang out in my classroom, or what, I can't shake them. And it's because they're not in a formal mentoring relationship with you, but you might be that mentor that kid has been needing. And it's like a magnet. They just want to connect to you. They gravitate towards you. And sometimes we do it with intention, and sometimes we do it without any intention. And so I just think, imagine how much more powerful it would be if we did just put, a small degree of intention towards creating opportunities for people to connect. It could be young staff that are just starting in their career with more veteran staff. It could be a student who's connecting to maybe an older high school student, or a student connecting to an adult on campus. So, there's not this magic formula for how to create these mentoring spaces. I think the most simple thing you just need to do is show up. You literally just show up for a kid, whether that's on Zoom, whether that's letting them know that you care, saying hello, acknowledging them, very simple things. That's the first step. Oftentimes in COVID, people aren't even making the time to connect, right? And so
I appreciate you bringing into the equation expanded learning too, because we have a lot of individuals, young people, that have the experiences of people of color and who have lived in poverty, who are doing this wonderful work of connecting with kids in this out-of-school environment, and would benefit greatly from having a core day teacher mentor them and build them up to be that future teacher or that future counselor. A lot of them are in that field for a long time because they don't know there's other opportunities for growth. So I am really excited, Gabby, about listening to Mr. Daly and seeing if he understands what a big mentor he was in your life.
Well, I'm excited to have him. I try to practice gratitude daily. And so I have actually several times, I always tell Mr. Daly, and he's, I think he kind of shows off when I've, been at his different school sites, and he'd say, she's a former student of mine. So, because he says it with pride. And for me, I'm excited. I think it'll be a real treat. I know he's entering a different phase now because he's recently retired, but I think he'll definitely highlight those points about even when we don't think we're a mentor, we are. And I've always expressed my gratitude to him because he definitely played that role for me. But I know he's played that role in the lives of so many other kids. So without further ado, how about we move on over and have Mr. Daly join us.
And now our special guest.
Our special guest today is Mr. Robert Daly, and that sounds a little bit strange for me to say because my whole life I've actually known Bob as Mr. Daly. He's a former teacher and mentor of mine. He was my 5th and 6th grade teacher, so it is a very special treat for me to have him with us. So Mr. Daly, thank you for joining us and giving of your time today. I appreciate you being here.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so Lisa, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much. We are really excited to relay the stories of how we all got to education in the field of education. So that's my first question I'm going to start off our interview with. What's your big why? Why, how, what was your journey to get to where you are today? Because now you're retired. But what was your journey before that? And can you explain a little bit about where you ended up?
Well, it's interesting. There's no doubt, especially where I ended up. I grew up in a small town in Iowa and ended up on the West Coast, 5 miles from the Mexican border. I am not bilingual. I do not speak Spanish. But the original reason why I got into everything is because I just had a natural likeness, or if not love for kids, especially elementary kids. And that's what I wanted to do from a very long period of time. From high school, I was, helping tutor elementary kids and studied it throughout college and became a teacher in the Midwest for a few years before I moved out to the West Coast and taught for like 14 years and then was an administrator for 19 of that. Just basically, it still came down to the essence for a real appreciation for the success of kids and being behind that and providing them that guidance and so that they could go on. Much like Ms. Delgado did here, she's the ideal model for what I wanted to achieve in my career. And that's where I ended up where I did.
When you go back and you said that in high school you started tutoring, is that when you got the bug? Had you thought initially for your career that that's what you wanted to do? And then if so, was that the bug kind of in high school or?
It was. And I also came from a very large family. I had 10 brothers and sisters. And so I had some younger siblings that I, basically helped raise. And so that was part of the background too, I'm sure. But yes, in high school, when I started to help tutor the elementary kids, and we'd visit the elementary school. And I actually loved my elementary school days. I actually have fond memories of that. And that actually helped kind of push me in that direction.
What kind of memories do you have? I'm going to ask you to explore that a little bit. We're trying to get to that kernel, that spark, that was what kind of set you on. And sometimes it's kind of unpacking it and going back. Anything?
Actually, when you look at it that way, that is what was behind it, because I enjoyed those days so much. And then so my goal in life was to actually make that same thing happen for elementary kids so that they enjoyed elementary school. I just really enjoyed school, especially at the elementary level, forever. And, and held teachers in high regard. And so I wanted to become one of those people. So I guess it all goes back to that. I have, out of the 11 of us, there's only one other educator in our family, which I'm kind of surprised, but there is one other one. But we always, as a family, valued education, and there was always high expectations too. You were supposed to achieve. That was just understood. And actually that's what I did as a principal, especially, is I wanted kids to achieve. I wanted them to set goals, so that their future lives would be better.
So, Mr. Daly, and I can attest to that for our listeners, because I am a product of your teaching, and I can clearly remember the very high expectations and structure in your classrooms that I will say served me well, and I do believe it served all of my peers well. But you mentioned something earlier. So, for some of our viewers and listeners, I should say, when you say you moved from Iowa and landed in a small city in about 5 miles from the largest international border, can you provide some context as to what it was like to be a transplant from Iowa and land in the South County part of San Diego? Because I would imagine it's very different from your upbringing. So what was that like? Challenges or beautiful experiences you might have had in your teaching time while you were there?
The words culture shock come to mind. It's very different. Very different, very different pace of life, much more diverse in Southern California than where I came from. But I was able to really embrace that. I have students that come back to me that still communicate with me that, they're very diverse, all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. How I landed there, I would have never guessed. But the one thing I always kind of held as a background too is kids always understand you, no matter what language you use, based on how you treat them. They always understand tone. They know when you're happy with them. Sometimes they know when you're not 100% happy with them also, just by the way you talk to them. But it was about establishing those relationships with those kids though, that did that. I hope I haven't strayed too far from your question, Gabby, but it is odd. Now that I'm retired and I reflect back, I do still wonder how I ended up where I did. You believe in fate, and whatever's meant to be is meant to be. So.
And I do believe it is in how you treated everybody the same. I will say that. Parents, even though there was that language barrier, you always found a way around it, whether it was your own students like myself doing the translation or another parent mom that would rush over and assist. And I will say that you had a way that you embraced that diversity. And I'm shocked at how many years you actually served in a community and really didn't pick up much Spanish, Mr. Daly. I will say, not a whole lot of words you picked up, but you somehow made it work. And I do really think it's because of your genuine care for people. And I think people were drawn to that. And they didn't care that you were the white teacher or the principal. He's a cool guy and he cares. He's strict. He's very strict, but he's also very supportive. And so I think people just kind of saw past that. I never saw it as a barrier. I don't think any of my peers did either.
After 34 years in the business, you establish those relationships, and that's really what it was all about. One of the ultimate compliments I ever got was at a 6th grade graduation ceremony at Central, which was a really diverse school. One of the 6th grade speakers said, "Mr. Daly's pretty cool for a white guy." That's exactly what she said. And she meant it as the ultimate compliment.
Absolutely.
And I took it as that.
So I'm curious, what are some lessons that students have taught you?
It took me a while to learn this, and I'll admit that I didn't always have this quality, but it was empathy for their situations. You really had to consider each individual and where they were coming from and what their background was, and maybe some of the challenges that they were dealing with, instead of just coming at them why didn't this happen? Why didn't this happen? And that took a while sometimes. And I'll admit, I mellowed through the years, Gabby. Gabby did the tough time, but I think it still did her well. But as years progressed, they say you become a little more sensitive to those things. And I did as I went on. So kids taught me that, and to listen to kids and let them speak on their own behalf and what their background was. And again, some of the challenges that they were facing. So that was important after a while. But you also didn't let them off the hook. You couldn't do that. It was the same thing, keeping them accountable and then keeping myself accountable to the needs of them.
I'm interested because of your career. You've had the ability to kind of evolve and see the changing landscape of education and how that might look from when you started to when you left. I wonder, particularly around the empathy pieces, because now we're kind of swinging to the social emotional. And I wonder what your thoughts might be when you started out. How did that look like?
Well, the job hasn't gotten any easier. That's for sure. And I was always, and Gabby will tell you this, I was always a pretty strong disciplinarian with students, but also was fair. always thought I was very fair with it. But some of the trends I started to see later on, because there were factors that were involved in the success of your schools, as far as like discipline measures and how those things got reported and everything. So it's not like you still can't take care of that, but you can. But you also, they are looking deeper into, why a kid behaves the way he does and what's going on. And before, it used to be much more of a shallow look. So that has helped. But at the same time, you have to have that balance of still making kids responsible and accountable. And sometimes I worry about that now, where sometimes a kid isn't really given the message that, hey, what you did was wrong. And when you make a choice like that, there is a consequence. And we have to be careful with that, because I want kids still to be accountable and responsible for their actions. And sometimes actually, and I've seen that before, where it's I don't want to say it as like, well, it's almost as if they got away with something, but they didn't learn anything from the experience. And then it occurs again. And people wonder why. Well, it's because the message wasn't sent. That's the one thing I kind of am concerned about.
So one of the things that Lisa and I talk a lot about, especially recently, is that this idea that learning and how learning is happening is really expanding. And it's really stretching educators in a lot of different ways. It's especially those who have their own kids at home and they're trying to balance distance learning and things of that nature. And I know you, in the different sites that you've served, you've always had expanded learning and enrichment programs that supported academic and core day instruction. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts around kind of where we are right now with serving students in this very different landscape in education in the middle of a pandemic, and how could we maybe leverage those expanded learning programs to continue to serve students?
Right now, it's very, very difficult. Right now, it's very difficult. There's a lot of people that are still in the business that I still stay in contact with that are telling me, you are so lucky that I retired when I did. But the distance learning thing has me deeply concerned, because without the face-to-face contact and the relationship with the kid, I think there's a huge gap that is really, really difficult to overcome through distance learning. You know me, Gabby, I've always thought of things, and there's things that stick in my head, and I'll come up with an acronym for something, and so that it helps you remember, or a saying or something like that. And the one that kind of bothers me right now is distance learning the learning is pretty distant. It's the way it seems, because I've Zoomed with classes, and I also, obviously have a close relationship with another teacher that Zooms with classes, and just to watch their attention level when the teacher is doing that live is like, whoa, the distractions that go on, just in the Zoom thing. Little brother comes along, or they go to get something to eat, or the focus is really, really lacking compared to sitting in a regular classroom. So something has to give in that matter. Something has to change where we can really, really get to these kids, because I think learning through distance learning, as far as like a turn back into your input, I know because I was even doing it that last year for a while, it's a very low percentage compared to if you're in the classroom, what your turn back is, what you get from the kids. So that's got to change, and it's got to change because it's where we're going.
It just really highlights, I think, how important that social interaction is for kids of all ages, because I know Lisa has a lot of she serves all of our high school programs as well that have expanded learning programming. And so I know in a lot of the surveys that Lisa has recently sent out, that data collection is showing they're just wanting to connect and not really so much to talk about, beautifully crafted lesson. No offense to all the hard work that goes into that, but they're just really wanting to, how are you? And I get to see you. And I think for me, that's the heartbreaking part of all of this, that for a lot of kids who don't have those positive interactions in their own family or community environment, school was the place where they were getting that. And that's been difficult for me when I think about that, because I think all those kids that we've served, that you've taught and served directly, those are the pieces, that's where they light up when they see you, because you're that positive force in their life for that day. And so we're trying to be creative and think if we can maybe offer a piece of that in this time, because we don't know how long we're going to be having to do it this way, that might be enough to then re-engage them back into the learning.
Well, every kid needs that. every kid needs that. Now, I think there's different levels for different kids, and some are needing it more than others, but every kid needs a piece of that. I've had moments throughout my career where that was just reinforced to me. I know one example was a couple of years ago. I was leaving the site, and it was fairly late, like 5 or 5:30 in the evening. And I was walking out the door, and I saw an ex-student walking down the sidewalk coming right to our school. And he was a freshman in high school at that time. And I knew him from, I had him from kindergarten through 6th grade. And I knew him, and he was a little bit of a pistol, through that time. But I loved him. I loved his personality, and we had a lot of conversations through the years. And as he was coming down, I could tell he actually looked a little disheveled. And it was the first week of school. And I was asking him what he had done. And I remember his first name was Gio. And I said, "Hey, Gio, how are you doing?" And he wasn't 100% happy, I could tell. And his hair had gotten really long. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he had said, "Oh, I'm doing okay." And I said, "Well, what are you up to?" And he goes, I just enrolled myself at Chula Vista High School." He said he enrolled himself. And I know he had lived with his grandma off and on through when he was in elementary school. And I said, "Yourself?" He goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, what's going on at home?" "Oh, it's not good." And I said, "Well, are you meeting up with friends or something like that?" He goes, "You know what, Mr. Daly, I didn't have many friends." And I go, well, you socialize people." He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Mr. Daly," he goes, "you were my best friend when I was here."
Oh.
That shocked me when he said that. I never viewed that from my perspective, like I was his best friend. But now when he said that, it dawned on me like, oh my gosh, like our relationship was a lot what he had in his mind, what was going on. And it kind of like tore my heart out when he said that, because if I was the best thing that he had in his life, I was a little worried about that. But it meant a lot to me at the same time. But also it made me realize like, wow, look what some of our kids come to school with. And this is what they have to look forward to.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about that you said you come from this big family, and that probably was that a supportive family? Do you think that you were kind of formed who you are today based on that family?
His family situation was difficult. Grandmother was raising him, and she would actually, and I didn't get many emails from parents, believe it or not. Not from there, it just didn't. She would email me. And she would email me about him, like what was going on with him. And she had issues with him, discipline-wise. She had started to lose control of him, was what the problem was. But when he was with me, he was a little rambunctious and stuff, but he always controlled himself to a point, because he just knew like, hey, you know what, I'm going to get called out on this if this happens. And so she would write me advice, ask me for advice and stuff with him. And then after he left us, well, I don't know exactly what went on with him through middle school, but his life was challenging. He had a difficult life. And so I'm just hoping that, he found some kind of guidance in high school and was able to get through. I told him, the door was always open. He could come down and check with me anytime, but I hadn't seen him since then. So, you worry about him, but what can you do?
Now that you have entered this new chapter in your life and you don't have to be worrying right now about getting a classroom set up or your lessons. And I can imagine it's exciting to start something new, but I'm curious, are you reflecting at all on the 30 some years of your career? And I'm curious if you thought about really what was the biggest challenge that you had serving in education? And then also what was the biggest joy?
It's hard to say. This is a difficult question. There's definitely things that I miss, and most of what I miss is the interaction with the people. Both students, staff, parents. The interaction is what I miss. The things that I don't miss, though, was the compliance, especially from an administrator's perspective, and what we were asked to do and what we had to do, and the paperwork that went in behind it. Oh, it got to be a lot. And it actually got to be too much. I had never really thought about retirement until very, very late in my career. And what made me what kind of brought it to mind was a teacher that was on my staff that I knew was 9 months younger than me was retiring. And I said, what? Like, how can he be retiring? He's like 9 months younger than me. And then I realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm like not that far away from this. I can do this too. I never thought about it though before then, because I actually enjoyed my work, and you get wrapped up and you get busy and you don't think about that. I know a lot of retired principals. Many of them retired before my age, before they did. And I think that's one thing you have to worry about in education, that there is a lot of burnout now, especially from the administrative perspective. When I talk to people throughout the country, and I have, and I was a principal of an elementary school with 700 students, no assistant principal, 700. We had 716 at one time at that point. Now that's a big job. You talk to people, because I'd go to conventions, because we had the No Excuses program, which was a big backbone of what we did at Howard Pence anyway. Talk to people from Texas, stuff like that. How many students do you have? 450. What? 450? Yeah, but my AP is taking care of stuff while I'm here. Oh. You have an AP? I'd be like, what? Yeah, and then our specialist takes care. What? You have a PE teacher, you have a music teacher, you have on-site psychologist, on-site nurse. Big difference throughout the country on kind of what's expected of you and just the way things are laid out. You find that out.
And what was your biggest joy?
The biggest joy is just watching the accomplishments of kids. There's numerous stories. There's numerous kids that came back, and there's kids that went into education, and because they valued what they had there. We had a great story of a student that he came back to me and he lauded our No Excuses program, because when he graduated from Montgomery High, he was the magna cum laude, and everything, and he got a full 5-year scholarship to the University of Southern Cal. And that was the one thing we were always waiting to see happen. And he came back and told me specifically he did it because of what he was taught in elementary school. Now, if that's not more rewarding than anything, that's the icing on the cake right there.
That makes all of your paperwork and compliance worth it?
Well, unfortunately, you can't get around those things. But it is, like I said before, even if you missed a deadline and all this stuff, as long as you didn't lose your job over it, it still was going to be, what was going to be remembered was the way you treated people. They wouldn't remember, oh, you know what? Oh, yeah, you were always so good at turning in paperwork. That isn't what it was about. That isn't what it was about.
Well, we always kind of end our interview with this one big question. So you have a magic wand, you have a paintbrush, and you can really do whatever you want in education. What does that look like to you in 10 years?
In 10 years. I guess in 10 years, what I'd like to see is just fully functioning schools that meet all of the needs of the kids, no matter what it is that they need. I'll admit, we started to see more and more social emotional problems with students all the time. Crazy things that would be going on. So what I'd love to see is, though, an all-encompassing school that also helps them at home, and especially from the very beginning. They always said that Title I money, your school's a Title I school. Well, to me, Title I money should have went to the hospitals from the time they were born, because by the time we get them, they're 5, maybe 4 if they're a TKer. A lot of it's been set in place. And we work, with what comes in the door when they're 5 years old. But a lot of them, you can tell, there's stuff at home that didn't quite happen. It didn't help, which we could help the parents so much more, I think, as far as that goes. And that would help the whole system. So some type of system in place that just takes care of all the needs that's possible, which is a huge task, I know. I'm not sure again what that would look like, because I don't know what this wand would fix. But I was fortunate though that I'd come from some good schools with good people, and you can always find good people. Had some really good staff members. Most families valued education, and so they, and at the beginning of the year when we did our back to school night, my one speech to parents would be, "I know what you want. You want a life that's better for your child than the one you had." And what parent says no? They don't. And so, no, you're right. I said, well, that's why we're here, to help you ensure that happens. And then, so they're like, well, hey, if that's what you want, that's what I want. We're on the same page. We go from there. Again, I hope I've answered your question, but that's a difficult one.
No, you have. And I know you're just a month into your retirement. And like you said, it might feel a little different come end of August or September when you would have normally been going back. But I will say, I was disappointed to hear that you retired. And I know you had already served 30 plus years, and not that you didn't deserve it, but I was disappointed because I really felt like it was a big loss. And a big loss, especially in a district that in the county of San Diego is very close to the border, that oftentimes is painted in this, oh, they're all marginalized students. Not all of them. There's a lot of amazing things happening in the South County region of San Diego, and it is oftentimes overlooked. And that's why I felt that sense of disappointment when you had texted me saying, I'm doing it, it's official. And I thought, oh no, those kids that he was serving. And so my heart broke a little for them, although I was happy for you, because I think it's time. I know you have a grandson now, and I know it's a different time in your life, but I did feel a bit saddened because you're one of the good ones. And, there's a lot of people doing great things in education, but you really are one of the good ones, Mr. Daly. So I think you will be very missed in that district. So I appreciate you joining Lisa and me, and I appreciate you being an ongoing mentor for me. I have your phone, so you can't ever really get rid of me. I was one of those students that always found you, but I appreciate you, and congratulations on your retirement. You do deserve it. And I hope that you can continue to serve students and schools in another capacity in this next journey.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, Gabby, very much so. And you know what, it was students like Gabby, without like going back and forth here, but it was kids like that, though, that made your career worthwhile. The one final thing I would say is, and Gabby knows this about me, I'm also a very competitive person. And I would tell our kids, you're going to compete in that world. And you're going to compete with kids coming from other schools that, they have a different image than what we're coming from. I said, but you take that as a challenge. You put that chip on your shoulder and you use that, and many of our kids did that. They were right, and we had a lot of pride. I mean, that's at Pennsford, what do you have? We have Penguin pride. We were the Penguins. Don't ask me how, but you wanted to instill pride in your kids so they were proud where they came from and that they could carry it on. And even when I go back to when I had Gabby, which was a long time ago, it was the same thing. And you instill confidence in them, though. That's the other thing, too, is you have to be able to tell them they can do it. Because a lot of those kids, they're first-generation kids that are going to do it in their families. So, and that's what you had to kind of push them to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much, because from 2 first generations, we appreciate all the work that you've done. And we can definitely, our colleagues who are first generation, we're always talking about the elementary school level as that foundational support, and one or two teachers that made such a difference in seeing the potential that we had. And I can hear that, and I'm just I'm so thankful that you had 30 years. And how many ripples did you make that you don't even know? This is your life, Mr. Daly. Remember those?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you both very much. I appreciate giving the opportunity to talk to you both.
Thank you. And now our closing thoughts. Gabby, I was really impacted by the story that Mr. Daly told of Geo, and that he was his best friend, and that whole story that unraveled, that really made me think so much about how our students, especially now with COVID and being at home, all the things that our students go through at home or in their lives that we just don't have any clue. And I'm wondering, in that regard, in our reflection, would you be willing to share why you selected Mr. Daly for this interview, and your own experiences of his mentorship?
When we were thinking of different people to invite that are in education or serve students in expanded learning or know about chaos theory or all of these, when we've been brainstorming, who do we invite? I naturally thought of him because he's played such a pivotal role in my own development. And I think so much of what we see, especially in expanded learning, programs is that naturally happens. These, amazing staff take on the role of a mentor unbeknownst to them. I mean, the job posting doesn't always say, by the way, you're also going to be a mentor to a kid. It just says, have great energy and be ready to create wonderful activities and enrichment and academic support. And Mr. Daly, in a sense, I think because he was my 5th and 6th grade teacher, naturally was in that role of being a mentor, but I don't think he sought out to be a mentor. I think in his mind, he's thinking, I'm this great teacher and I want to teach the standards and push these kids, because he was hard. By that I mean is he had some pretty high standards, and he pushed you, even when, you didn't want to do certain things, he would push all of us to do more. And it wasn't until later that I had ever told Mr. Daly, I had a lot going on in elementary school. And he said, what are you talking about? Your mom came to all the conferences, you would translate for her. And I'm like, yeah, she would come to parent night and all that. And, mainly because my dad was always working, but he didn't really know that it was hard growing up. I wasn't born here. My dad was an alcoholic. It was difficult growing up as a kid. My mom struggled to make ends meet, but I never told Mr. Daly any of that drama. Mm-hmm. Part of it is because you're taught like, hey, that's personal. You keep it at home, right? He also didn't probe because he didn't necessarily have to, because I was a good student. I'd show up every day. I'd always be on time. Unlike what he shared with Gio, where Gio was displaying some signs of like something's not okay. I was the opposite of, I'm your overachieving kid. And so you would never think to ask, hey, is everything going on? Or is everything okay? And so Mr. Daly, what I always appreciated about him is that, again, he didn't know that he was a mentor, because I don't know if his interactions would have been any different with me had he known. I don't think that they would have been. I think he would have treated me the same way he treated every other kid in his class. And, like I said, it wasn't until much later, I think I was in college, where I finally said to him, that wasn't like the easiest time of my life. That was hard.
Wow.
It was a difficult time. We struggled financially. Again, a lot of things going on at home. But he saw I had 3 older sisters that were doing very well. So he just thought, geez, this kid's fine. This kid will do just absolutely fine. And I did, but I don't think he realized, but it's because I had teachers like him.
Right.
That would push and have high expectations, and didn't care that, we were first generation. That never played into his mind, I don't think, in how he treated me. So yeah, unbeknownst to Mr. Daly, he actually had quite a significant impact on my development. And I think even more so because it was done unintentional. Like I said in the beginning, sometimes people sign up to be a mentor. Like they go out of their way. They say, I want to be enrolled in this community-based program, and I want to mentor a kid who needs a mentor because they're from a single parent household or whatever. And you enter a formal mentoring relationship. And I didn't ever have that with Mr. Daly. He was a teacher, and I just always gravitated at those anchors that you talked about earlier. He was an anchor. And Now I think that's right. I just like naturally would gravitate. I think because he provided structure and he was always fair. Even when although I was a quote unquote good student, if I did something that I wasn't supposed to be doing, man, he would know. And he would call me out. And I would get in trouble, but I always knew he wasn't going to hold a grudge. He'd let it go. And then it was like, you're back to normal the next day. And I don't think I don't know. I should have asked him actually, did you do that on purpose? Did you know you were mentoring? Maybe teachers don't realize the power that they have in their roles, that you are actually a mentor, even though that may not be part of your title. Every single day you're mentoring kids. Maybe it just looks and feels different because it's not that formal structure that we're used to.
I don't think it's such a difficult thing because we don't have a course that you have in teacher ed called purposeful mentoring. Yeah. And so I think what you were saying just hit me, because a lot of times when you have those chaotic spaces or things that are happening, and life is so complex, there's so many different variables. And so we're not saying, I don't think, teachers, you have to take on this extra role as, something in addition to the curriculum, but it is like, how do you define that? There's a great book called Pivotal Moments. Like everything that you do and say and the way that you engage, that you are kind of on a stage with kids. And it's almost like when you have a child, they are listening, they are watching. And oftentimes it is just the simple connection that is the anchor. It makes that strong. Like think about it in a neurons, like your brain, all of a sudden you grew a neuron and now you're connected with that person. But that also, you mentioned structure. Because when you are living in trauma, a lot of that seems so unstructured. I think a lot of people now realize what that is in a profound way. But sometimes it's just a matter of somebody saying to you, nope, you're not going to do this. You're going to do this way. You're going to do your college app. I don't care if you want to go to school, because it doesn't mean that you have to say, I believe in you. This and that, it's just a matter of providing some structures and support.
Yeah. When you were just sharing that, it made me think, I absolutely agree with you in that sometimes if we present the idea of mentoring, people might be thinking, oh no, it's an additional duty and I don't have to, it's too much pressure. And what you're saying is you're actually already doing that. And a perfect example of that is, and Mr. Daly probably doesn't even remember doing this, but when I had him for 6th grade, the school would offer 6th grade camp and you'd be gone.
Oh,
back in the day, it was you were gone.
Yes.
4 nights. So let me just tell you, probably can relate to this. So the idea of being gone overnight to a very traditional Mexican family whose parents, speak. My mom didn't ever actually learn to speak English. My dad, very limited English. The idea that your child is going to be spending the night with strangers is like the most foreign thing. And so I already knew, I thought, I'm not even going to ask because 4 nights in, camp. I went to Camp Cuyamaca.
Yay!
Yeah.
Woo!
This was like, could have been, you might as well be sending me to Mars. It just seemed like, that's so far away from where we live, right? And so I told Mr. Day, well, you didn't sign the permission slip. And I said, this isn't going to happen. It costs money. And I think I just told him, like, this isn't going to happen. And he didn't ask a whole lot of questions. And the next thing I knew is he said, you're going to be able to go. You just have to get the permission slip. And I'm like, dude, I don't have the money. What are you not understanding? There was a scholarship. And I believe, if memory serves me right, that he went to the PTA. So someone at the school had a scholarship. And so he asked, will you sponsor this student who doesn't have the means? And they said, yeah. And so when I went to my mom, I said, no, Mom, it's going to be free. It was like, well, now she doesn't have an excuse to go. Can I tell you, to this day, my 3 oldest sisters, they're all old. I'm the baby. That didn't sound right. They, to this day, hold it against me that I'm the only one in the family that was allowed to go to 6th grade camp. And so I tell you, like, siblings just give each other, that natural hard time. I kid you not. If I bring up 6th grade camp to my sisters, one of them is going to be, oh yeah, because Gabby got to go because she's the baby. And I always say, no, it's because I got to go because I had an amazing teacher that went and got it paid for me. And
Wow.
my mom, it was hard. She was not liking the idea, but he convinced her that it's totally okay. She did tell them that she has to call when you get there. And I was the only kid, I know I'm embarrassing, the only kid had to go to the office and had to use their landline, of course, back in the day.
Yeah.
To call saying, Mom, I'm okay, we're here, it's safe. And she's like, okay, pórtate bien, which is, be on good behavior, all of that good stuff. But Mr. Daly probably doesn't even remember that story.
Wow.
And I remember because it was a really cool thing for me to be the first time I was ever away from my family overnight. We wouldn't even be allowed to spend the night at friends' homes. My mom always thought that was bizarre. It's like, why would you spend the night at someone's house? You have a house. You're not homeless. Why are you trying to sleep at someone else's house? Like, we don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So to be gone, and then I remember learning to make soap from a yucca plant and going on a hike. I remember that vividly. So I have a lot of love and care for outdoor education because I didn't have the means as a kid. And that teacher, Mr. Daly, removed that barrier. By him doing that, it exposed me to a whole nother world where I'm like, this is a really cool thing to be out in nature. And it was just, again, within his role as a teacher. That isn't something that, like you're saying, not part of a class you take, but that's what you do as a teacher. It's what you would do as a counselor. It's like, I remove barriers from my students. So they don't have a way to pay for it. Let me find a way to see if I can get it sponsored, right? And so that's just one example of that the mentoring doesn't have to be this very formalized deal. It's actually already what people are doing. But the minute you put just a little bit of intention and that's sprinkled into your everyday interactions with kids, it just has the power to really be so much more influential than you thought it could be.
Absolutely. And I think Mr. Daly is in a time of his life that is well deserved. And I think we both probably wish him the best.
And are a little jealous.
And are a little jealous, yes. And I just really appreciate, Gabby, that you were able to connect with him and that he was able to share his story.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to having a former teacher. You know, I think he has great insight, and I think it ties in nicely to our podcast. So we can leave our listeners with anything. It's that, again, these seeds that you're constantly planting with students can actually be done via Zoom in our current environment. It can. I know it looks and feels different, but you just, by showing up, saying, I'm here, I'm happy to actually see you. I hope that you're doing okay. Let me know if you're not. What can I do? Goes such a long way, especially for our kids right now that we know are missing those connections. So if I could just leave just a parting thought for folks is, don't underestimate the ability and the power that you have to really make an impact on kids' lives. Even if right now we're on distance learning or hybrid or whatever your district might be doing, I know it's not a perfect setup and everyone's feeling the stress of it, but you showing up every day can absolutely make a difference for a kid. I know it sounds corny because we say that a lot, but absolutely can make a difference for a kid. With that, I'm Gabby.
And I'm Lisa. And thanks for listening to Two Counselors and a Mic. See you next time.